The sun beat down on the red sandstone cliffs of Arizona Territory as James Thornton and his wife Sarah stood looking up at the massive rock formation that would change their lives. It was 1887, and they had just purchased 40 acres of what everyone in Copper Springs called worthless land. Nothing but rocks and rattlesnakes, the land agent had warned them, shaking his head at their foolishness. But James and Sarah saw something different. They saw possibility where others saw only obstacles. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a natural alcove carved into the cliff face by millennia of wind and water. "That's where we'll build." James nodded, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. Inside the rock itself, protected from sun, wind, and storm. "People will think we've lost our minds," Sarah added with a slight smile, though her eyes showed she knew exactly what they faced. "Let them think what they want. We know what we're doing." And they did. James had worked as a surveyor for the railroad, studying geology and natural formations across the Western Territories. He understood rock stability, water drainage, thermal properties of stone. Sarah had grown up on the Navajo reservation, where her missionary parents had worked, and she'd learned from the indigenous people about cliff dwellings that had sheltered families for centuries. She knew the ancient wisdom, the practical knowledge passed down through generations. Together, they understood what the townspeople of Copper Springs did not, that sometimes the strongest house is the one you don't build from scratch, but the one you find already waiting in the bones of the earth. The news spread through Copper Springs faster than a wildfire in dry grass. James and Sarah Thornton, the young couple who'd arrived 6 months ago with railroad money and big dreams, were planning to build their home inside a cliff. Not near a cliff. Not against a cliff. Inside it. "That's the most foolish thing I've ever heard," declared Martin Fletcher, the town's banker, over dinner at the hotel. "Living in a rock like some kind of primitive? It's 1887, for heaven's sake. We have civilization now." "But why would anyone choose that?" asked Rebecca Walsh, the school teacher. "It would be dark, probably damp. How would they even breathe properly in there?" "Maybe they're just eccentric," suggested Dr. Harrison Webb, though his tone suggested he thought it was something worse than eccentricity. "Railroad work does strange things to a man's mind. All that travel, no stable home, and the wife went along with it, which tells you something about her judgment." The criticism stung Sarah more than James when word got back to them. She'd expected resistance to their unconventional plan, but the personal judgments hurt. Still, she kept her resolve. "They don't understand," she told James as they made their first trip up to the site with surveying equipment. "They think we're rejecting civilization. We're not. We're just choosing better shelter." "They'll understand eventually," James replied. "When the summer heat gets unbearable and winter freezes their water pipes, they'll start to wonder why we look so comfortable." The alcove they'd chosen was remarkable, about 60 feet wide and 30 feet deep, carved into the cliff face some 20 feet above the ground level. The overhang protected it from direct rain and the worst of the summer sun. The rock itself was solid sandstone, worn smooth by ages of wind but structurally sound, tested over countless millennia. A natural seep spring emerged from a crack in the back wall, providing fresh water year-round. The Sinagua people built in places like this 600 years ago, Sarah explained to anyone who'd listen, though few did. Not because they were primitive, but because they understood the advantages: thermal mass, protection from elements, defensible position, water access. The Sinagua also disappeared, someone would inevitably point out. Maybe living in cliffs wasn't such a good idea after all. They left because of drought, Not because their dwellings failed, Sarah would counter. But by then, people had usually stopped listening. Construction began in early spring. The first task was building a secure path and steps up to the alcove. James carved footholds into the rock face and installed a rope railing, creating access that was steep but manageable. It took weeks of careful work, chiseling into ancient stone, testing each step for safety. Then came the real work, building a proper home within the natural shelter. The design was Sarah's masterpiece. Unlike the cave in Montana, where Logan McKenna had built a standalone cabin inside a cavern, the Thorntons' home would be integrated into the cliff itself. They built walls that connected the natural rock on either side, essentially enclosing the front of the alcove. These walls were constructed from adobe bricks they made themselves, mixing clay from the valley floor with straw and water, forming thousands of bricks that dried in the Arizona sun. "They're building a house out of mud," the townspeople observed, watching from below with spyglasses. "That'll wash away in the first rain." But James and Sarah knew better. Adobe had been used in the Southwest for centuries. Properly made and maintained, it was incredibly durable. And more importantly, it provided excellent insulation and thermal mass to complement the rock's natural properties. The front wall rose slowly over the summer months. James and Sarah worked side by side, starting before dawn to avoid the worst heat. They hauled materials up the cliff path, James carrying timber and tools, while Sarah balanced buckets of water and clay. The adobe bricks were their joint creation. James would dig clay from a rich deposit 2 miles away. Sarah would mix it with straw and water, her hands becoming strong from the work. They'd pour the mixture into wooden forms, creating dozens of bricks that dried in the merciless sun. Each brick took days to cure properly. Sarah developed an instinct for the perfect drying time, checking them by touch and sound, tapping to hear the right hollow note that meant they were ready. The construction was painstaking. Each brick had to be placed perfectly, the wall rising level and true. James used a plumb line constantly. "A wall is only as strong as its weakest brick," he would say. "We're building for generations, not just for us." They built in windows, real glass panes from Santa Fe, hauled up with extreme care. Sarah positioned them precisely, understanding how the sun would move through the seasons. Morning light in the bedroom, western exposure in the living area for evening warmth. They installed a solid wooden door that James made himself. Sarah carved Navajo designs into it, symbols of protection and welcome. Inside, they created rooms with interior adobe walls. The main living area opened to the full height of the alcove ceiling, about 15 feet at its peak, feeling cathedral-like yet intimate. A bedroom was partitioned to one side. The kitchen area near the spring had counter space carved into the rock itself. Storage alcoves were created in natural indentations in the walls, each space designed with purpose. "Look at them," people would say, gathering in town to discuss the spectacle. "Living up there like cliff swallows. What happens when winter comes and they freeze? Adobe and rock won't keep them warm. What happens when summer comes and they roast?" Others added. "That rock will hold heat like an oven." The saloon became the unofficial headquarters for Thornton watching. Men would gather in the evening, drinks in hand, sharing their latest observations. "Saw them hauling water up today," someone would report. "Must have made a dozen trips. All that work just to live in a hole in the rock." "I give them 2 months," a ranch hand predicted. "When the first rattlesnake crawls into that cave, Sarah Thornton will be screaming her way back to town." "Or a mountain lion," another suggested. "Cats like caves. They might come home one day and find one already moved in." The women of Copper Springs were equally critical. seeing Sarah's choices as a rejection of proper domesticity. They gathered for quilting circles and church socials, and the Thornton cliff dwelling was inevitably a topic. Eliza Fletcher, the banker's wife, was particularly vocal. She held considerable social influence in town. Sarah Thornton could have had a proper home in town, she declared over tea one afternoon. A nice wooden house with a parlor for receiving guests and a garden for growing vegetables. Instead, she's up there making mud bricks like a peasant. It's embarrassing for all women. What message does it send? Perhaps she finds it romantic, suggested Miriam Cooper, trying to find a charitable interpretation. Young love, building something together. Romance doesn't survive reality, Eliza replied firmly. Wait until she's hauling water up that cliff in the cold or trying to cook in a dark cave. She'll see sense eventually. Some younger women were quietly curious, watching Sarah work with determination, wondering what it felt like to be so certain of an unconventional choice. But social pressure kept them from expressing support. James bore the comments with patient dignity. At the general store, buying supplies, he'd endure remarks. Still playing caveman, Thornton? Found any woolly mammoths up there? When you giving up this foolishness? He'd respond calmly, explaining thermal properties and natural shelter advantages, but most people had stopped listening. They'd already decided he was crazy, and no amount of scientific explanation would change their minds. But Sarah didn't feel embarrassed. She felt exhilarated. Every brick placed was a step toward a home that would work with nature instead of fighting against it. Every design decision was based on centuries of proven wisdom from people who'd understood desert living far better than the recent arrivals in Copper Springs. The chimney was particularly clever, designed by James with his engineering knowledge. It vented through a natural crack in the rock that led to the surface above. The draft was perfect, pulling smoke up and out, while the thermal mass of the rock warmed gradually from the fire, radiating heat long after the flames died down. For water, they built a collection system from the spring. It emerged from the rock at a steady trickle, year-round, never failing even in drought. James installed a pipe that directed it to a cistern they'd carved deeper into the rock, then to a smaller tank inside the kitchen area. Clean, cold water, always available. They'll get sick from cave water, predicted Dr. Webb. Springs and rocks carry all sorts of contamination. But the spring water was pure, filtered through hundreds of feet of sandstone. It was cleaner than the well water in town that sometimes ran brown after heavy rains. By late fall, the dwelling was complete. From below, it looked like a facade built into the cliff, adobe walls with windows that glowed warmly at night, a door that opened onto a small platform with a railing. But inside, it was spacious and surprisingly comfortable. The rock ceiling soared overhead, the natural stone textured and beautiful in lamplight. The adobe walls, 2 feet thick, provided massive thermal stability. The windows let in light and air without exposing them to the worst of the weather. James and Sarah moved in completely, bringing their possessions up the cliff path. They had a bed James had built from local pine, a table and chairs Sarah had helped design, a cast-iron stove that had required 6 men to haul up the cliff path, shelves for their books and dishes, and storage trunks. Not much, but all they needed. Their daily routine became a rhythm of contentment. Sarah would wake with dawn light streaming through the bedroom window, the air fresh and cool. She'd start coffee while James checked their water system. They'd breakfast together, watching the valley come to life. Then James would work on various projects while Sarah tended the house, though it required little maintenance. Afternoons, they'd often sit on their porch, reading or watching the world. From their vantage point, they could see for miles. The town spread out below, roads winding through the valley, hawks circling on thermals. It was peaceful in a way town living never could be. Evenings were for quiet companionship. Sarah would cook dinner, simple meals that tasted wonderful in their cozy home. They'd talk about their day, their plans, their dreams. Then they'd read by lamplight, Sarah working through geology books, James reading agricultural journals. "We give them until Christmas," the townspeople wagered. "When winter hits and they're hauling water up that cliff in freezing weather, when the wind howls and the temperature drops, they'll see sense and move back to town, where civilized people belong." But winter in Arizona wasn't like Montana. It got cold, yes, especially at night. Snow sometimes dusted the higher peaks, but the cliff dwelling proved its worth immediately. While homes in town used wood stoves constantly to fight the cold, burning through firewood at alarming rates, the Thorntons needed only a small fire morning and evening. The thermal mass of the rock and adobe absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. The alcove protected them from wind. The temperature inside rarely dropped below 50 degrees, even when it was freezing outside. "It's like the earth itself is keeping us warm," Sarah wrote in her journal. "The rock has been here for millions of years, absorbing the sun's heat. Now it shares that warmth with us." Water was never an issue. The spring flowed steadily, and they didn't have to venture out in bad weather to fetch it. Food stores stayed cool in the back recesses of the alcove, natural refrigeration that kept meat fresh and vegetables crisp. Spring came, and then summer, and that's when the cliff dwelling truly proved its superiority. Arizona summers are brutal. Temperatures in Copper Springs regularly exceeded 105 degrees. The sun blazed down relentlessly. Wooden houses became ovens. Adobe structures in town helped, but they still absorbed tremendous heat during the day. But the Thorntons' cliff dwelling remained comfortable. The rock overhang blocked direct sunlight during the hottest parts of the day. The thermal mass that kept them warm in winter now kept them cool in summer, the rock staying at a relatively constant temperature, regardless of the extremes outside. Cross-ventilation through the windows created breezes. The alcove's natural shade was like having a permanent covered porch. "It's at least 20 degrees cooler in here than in town," James noted, checking his thermometer. "Maybe more." People began to notice when July brought a heat wave that killed livestock and sent people searching for any shade they could find. The Thorntons were visibly comfortable. Some folks from town began making the climb up to visit, ostensibly to check on the eccentric couple, but really to experience the remarkable coolness of the cliff dwelling. "It's like a different climate up here," marveled Sheriff Tom Hendricks, fanning himself on the Thorntons' porch while the valley below shimmered with heat. "The rock moderates everything," Sarah explained, offering him cool water from the spring. "Hot or cold outside, it stays relatively constant in here. That's why the ancient peoples built in places like this. Maybe they weren't so primitive after all," the sheriff admitted. But the true test, the moment that would vindicate the Thorntons completely, came not from the heat of summer, but from the fury of a desert storm. It was late August, monsoon season in the Arizona territory. These weren't the snows of Montana, but they could be just as deadly. Desert storms came with little warning, bringing flash floods, lightning, and winds that could strip the roof off a building. The day started clear and hot, like any other summer day. But by noon, James noticed the signs. Clouds building to the south, a drop in temperature, a strange stillness in the air. "Big storm coming," he told Sarah. "Maybe the biggest we've seen." They secured their supplies, made sure the windows were fastened, and settled in to wait. In town, people noticed the signs too and hurried to prepare. Shutters closed. Animals brought in. Everyone hoping it would be just another summer thunderstorm. It wasn't. The storm hit at 2 in the afternoon with apocalyptic force. The sky turned black-green. Lightning struck so frequently it seemed like continuous daylight. Thunder shook the ground. And then came the rain. It didn't fall. It attacked, sheets of water driven horizontal by winds that exceeded 70 miles per hour. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes. Flash floods roared down every wash and arroyo, turning dry creek beds into raging torrents in seconds. In Copper Springs, chaos reigned. The wind tore the roof completely off the general store. Windows shattered in buildings all over town. The hotel's covered porch was ripped away and sent tumbling down the main street like tumbleweed. The church steeple toppled. Rain poured through broken roofs. Lightning struck the schoolhouse, starting a fire that the rain ironically extinguished before it could spread. The wash that ran through town, usually dry or a trickle, became a wall of water 15 feet high, sweeping away a storage shed and damaging the bridge. People huddled in their homes, terrified as the storm raged. Some buildings leaked so badly that families had to move from room to room, chasing the dry spots. Others watched in horror as their roofs sagged under the weight of water, threatening to collapse. But in the cliff dwelling, James and Sarah were safe. The storm's fury was visible through their windows, a spectacular display of nature's power, but the alcove protected them completely. The overhang kept the rain from reaching their door. The wind, even at its most violent, couldn't get purchase on their walls built into the rock. Lightning struck the cliff top above them, but the rock absorbed it harmlessly. Inside, they sat by their window, watching the storm with awe rather than fear. The temperature remained stable. No leaks, no wind whistling through cracks. The solid rock above them, millions of tons of sandstone, didn't budge or tremble. It had weathered 10,000 such storms and would weather 10,000 more. "We're safer than anyone in town," Sarah said softly, holding James's hand as lightning illuminated the valley below. "The old ones knew what they were doing when they built in places like this," James agreed. "This isn't primitive. This is the most advanced shelter design possible." The storm lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of biblical fury. When it finally passed, leaving behind a crystalline sky and a ransacked landscape, James and Sarah descended carefully to check on the town. What they found was devastation. Every building had damage. Some were destroyed. The main street was littered with debris, shattered wood, broken glass, tumbled adobe bricks. 3 people had died, struck by flying debris or caught in the flash flood. Dozens were injured. The property damage would take months to repair, and the townspeople were traumatized. They'd been powerless against the storm, sheltering in structures that proved inadequate, watching their homes fail around them. Martin Fletcher saw the Thorntons approaching and stared in disbelief. "Your house, did it survive?" "Completely," James replied. "Not even a leak." "But how?" "The wind was, the rain was." "The rock protected us," Sarah said simply. "Just like we knew it would." Word spread quickly. The couple who'd been mocked for building in a cliff, the eccentric fools living like primitives, had weathered the worst storm in territorial history without a scratch, while the civilized town had been devastated. Dr. Webb approached, his medical bag over his shoulder, exhausted from treating injuries. "Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, I owe you an apology. I called you foolish, but you're the only ones who built wisely." "You weren't wrong to question," Sarah replied kindly. "It does seem strange if you don't understand the principles." But natural shelter has protected humans for thousands of years. We just remembered what our society forgot. The transformation in attitude was immediate and profound. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about cliff dwellings. How did they work? Could more be built? Were there other alcoves in the area suitable for homes? The problem is suitable locations, James explained at a town meeting a week later. Not every cliff works. You need the right orientation, protection from weather, solid rock, water access. It's rare to find all those things together. But what about building principles? Asked Thomas Porter, the town's carpenter. What can we learn from your design that could make our regular houses better? That question began a revolution in local architecture. While few could build in cliffs, everyone could incorporate the principles: thermal mass through thick walls, proper orientation to manage sun exposure, working with natural features instead of fighting them, understanding how heat and cold move through structures. Sarah became an unlikely teacher, holding classes on adobe construction, thermal dynamics, and traditional building wisdom. James consulted on reconstruction projects, helping people rebuild stronger and smarter. But more importantly, the cliff dwelling became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the solution to a problem isn't newer or more advanced, but older and more fundamental. That mocking what seems strange might mean missing what's wise. That nature, properly understood and respected, provides better shelter than anything humans can build from scratch. Rebecca Walsh, the school teacher, brought her students to visit the cliff dwelling, making it a field trip to study geology, history, and practical science. Standing in the alcove, looking out over the valley, she told her students, "The Thorntons were called foolish, but they studied, they learned from history, and they built on wisdom that was old when this territory was new. Remember that the next time someone tells you that old means wrong or that different means foolish." Years passed. The cliff dwelling became famous in the territory and beyond. Architects traveled from back east to study it. Photographers captured images of the home built into the rock. Sarah and James raised 2 children there, a boy and a girl who grew up climbing the cliff path as easily as other children walked downstairs. The dwelling required minimal maintenance. The adobe walls needed replastering every few years, easily done. The rock remained as solid as ever. The spring never failed. In summer's heat and winter's cold, through storms and droughts, the home that everyone had mocked proved superior to every conventional structure in Copper Springs. Martin Fletcher, the banker who'd been most vocal in his criticism, eventually admitted, "I built my house the way everyone builds houses because I thought that was the right way. The Thorntons built their house the way physics and geology said they should, regardless of tradition. They were better scientists than any of us." When James and Sarah Thornton celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in their cliff dwelling, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends from Copper Springs, the governor of Arizona Territory himself attended. In his speech, he said, "This house represents something vital that we risk forgetting in our rush toward modernity, that the earth itself offers shelter if we're wise enough to accept it, that thousands of years of human experience shouldn't be dismissed as primitive, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ignore mockery and trust in knowledge." Sarah and James, now in their 70s, stood together on their porch carved into the cliff, looking out over the valley that had witnessed their vindication. Below, the town of Copper Springs had rebuilt, incorporating many of the principles they demonstrated. Adobe construction had become standard, homes oriented to manage heat and cold naturally, respect for traditional knowledge instead of blind faith in progress. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked James quietly. All the mockery we endured? James put his arm around her. Not for a single moment. We knew what we knew. We trusted knowledge over opinion. And every day, this home proves we were right. The old ones who built in cliffs first, Sarah mused. They couldn't have imagined that 1,000 years later, their wisdom would save a cowboy and his wife from a desert storm. Maybe they could, James suggested. Maybe that's exactly what they hoped, that future generations would remember and learn. The cliff dwelling still stands, of course. Rock endures. The adobe walls have been maintained by descendants and preservation societies. The spring still flows. Modern amenities have been carefully added, electricity and plumbing, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. It's now a historic site, visited by thousands each year, a testament to wisdom over convention. And in Copper Springs, now a small city, they remember the lesson that James and Sarah Thornton weren't eccentric or foolish or primitive. They were simply better informed than everyone who judged them. That building in a cliff wasn't a rejection of civilization, but an embrace of deeper knowledge about how humans can best shelter themselves from nature's extremes. The alcove entrance has a plaque now. The Thornton Cliff Dwelling, built 1887. When civilization mocked, wisdom built. When the storm came, the rock endured. Teaching that sometimes the strongest shelter is the one nature already prepared, waiting for those wise enough to recognize it. Modern survivalists, architects, and off-grid enthusiasts study the Thornton dwelling as an early example of passive solar design, thermal mass utilization, and working with natural formations. But the people of Copper Springs remember something simpler and more human, that a cowboy and his wife, facing ridicule and doubt, built a home based on knowledge rather than convention, and that home saved them when conventional wisdom failed everyone else. The rock still stands, as rocks do. The alcove still shelters, as it has for millions of years. And the lesson remains carved not just in stone, but in memory, that sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who truly understands survival, and that mockery often says more about the mocker's fear of the unfamiliar than it does about the wisdom of the mocked. James and Sarah Thornton taught their town something vital, that in the contest between human pride and natural law always wins. And the wise don't fight nature. They study it, respect it, and build with it, not against it, even when everyone else calls them fools for doing so.